Please welcome back President and CEO of the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, Kris Sarri.
Oh, thank you, guys. I hope everybody had a great break, was able to spend some time with our exhibitors. I quickly walked through the hall and I saw tons of people socializing with each other, so it is great to be back in person. So I wanted to welcome back to our next plenary, which is titled Fishing, Swimming, and Drinking, Why Clean Water Matters. By the way, whether you're here with us in the auditorium or watching elsewhere around the world via the virtual platform, we hope you'll share your thoughts on the plenaries via social media, just using the hashtag CHOW 2022. So I am thrilled to get to introduce our moderator for this, Michael Scozzafava. Michael is a branch chief for the Nonpoint management branch of the Environmental Protection Agency. His program provides national oversight and technical support for tribal, state, and territorial non-point source management programs. And that includes implementation of the Clean Water Act, Section 319, non-point source grant program, and a new $60 million program that supports actions that advance the goals of the Gulf Hypoxia Action Plan. So I'm very happy to introduce Michael to the stage, and he will introduce our panelists. Thank you very much.
Just hear me? Okay. Happy to be here today. Thanks for joining the session. I want to introduce our diverse panel of a lot of varied perspectives. So first, Kelly McGinnis, who's the Executive Director of the Mississippi River Network. We also have with us today Marel King, who is the Pennsylvania Director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission. As well as Fred Tutman, who is the Riverkeeper and CEO of the Patuxent Riverkeeper. And then virtually on the screen, we also have Dr. Kelsey Leonard, who's with the Shinnecock Nation. As well as Kirsten James, who's the Senior Program Director for Water with CERES. All right, so I think we have a very interesting panel, and we're going to be discussing a really big topic, which is water quality in the context of the Clean Water Act, with a real focus on the future, where we need to be, what we need to do, and how we need to think differently, potentially, about water quality. So this session will touch on a lot of different topics. We'll talk about climate change. We'll talk about non-point source pollution. Talk a little bit about environmental justice, and particularly equity and inclusion. But for now, I wanted to let each of the panelists give a brief introduction, and I'll just mention quickly that there are question cards on your seat. If you think of a question along the way, please pass it to your left, and I will collect those here, and around 11:50, we'll start going through the questions from the audience. All right? So let me start with Kelly. Introduce yourself and provide a few remarks.
Great.
Right.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today, so I'm thankful for this opportunity and grateful to get to share the stage with such wonderful people, so I'm really looking forward to the conversation. But my name is Kelly McGinnis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mississippi River Network. And the Mississippi River Network is a coalition of over 60 organizations working together. Our mission is a healthy Mississippi River for the people, water, land, and wildlife. We have members in all 10 main SEM states the river flows through, from headwaters to Gulf, as well as members based in DC, more national-focused organizations. And I think one of our strengths is working collaboratively in coalition with each other. And our members range from your typical environmental organizations and conservation organizations, but we also have artists and authors and canoe guide outfitters and community-led small organizations fighting the issues they're facing, in their backyard. So I think that gives us a lot of strength. And together we work on issues in a policy setting, and we also have the nation's only outreach program focused on the entirety of the Mississippi River called One Mississippi. And there's a lot of action going on this week for water. Obviously, we're all here together, and there's other conferences going on around rivers. And we actually are kicking off something today called Rivers Days of Action. That's 5 days of focus on the Mississippi River, over 30 events and education, as well as cleanups and fun things. So just wanted to mention that in case you would like to check out in some other river-focused events going on. But, and I think, it's notable to be here today in this panel talking about water quality in the context of the Clean Water Act and its 50th anniversary. And we've made tremendous strides because of the Clean Water Act in water quality, and yet there is still a long way to go. Currently, 50% of our rivers and streams are still so polluted they're considered impaired. Additionally, how the Clean Water Act has benefited communities has not been equitably distributed. And then there are more threats, like the climate crisis that we are facing, that exacerbate the issues we already have, and we have a tall order ahead of us. And I think this moment really requires more of a systems thinking approach. Our issues are all interconnected. We are all interconnected and connected to our water is connected to us. And we need to have more of an interdisciplinary policy solution approach, as well as a much larger coalition of broad issues. So even when you think of water issues, think of an example would be flooding, how flooding impacts hit people. So we need to be solving flooding issues in the context of how it impacts people and communities and housing. So it really requires a more systems approach and working collaboratively on these big issues. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Kelly. Fred, you want to go next?
Sure. So I didn't expect all of this. I will say that I have, for the last 19 years, run a local water quality program in a symbolic river in Maryland, the only river in Maryland history to actually be significantly cleaned up in the past, only to see those gains lost again. A river that stays entirely within the state of Maryland, a river that has the only state river commission in the state of Maryland. Symbolically, the river that also launched the Chesapeake Bay movement. It was activism and direct action by citizens on the Patuxent that actually led to the governor creating the Chesapeake Bay movement to create the political mass necessary to work on water. That said, it's also a statewide movement that has not been successful in cleaning up a single tributary of the Chesapeake Bay in the last 40 years. I believe that Patuxent Riverkeeper, among others, actually breaks what I call the fourth wall. We deal with the people who are typically the outsiders in movements that are largely comprised of insiders, the people who research them, who work on them for a living, people who have career aspirations attached to the goals that go to these rivers. Because I believe that's really where the action is, for us anyway. Patuxent Riverkeeper tries to work on where the worst problems are or can be found within the watershed, because in our view, those other problems don't seem nearly as severe if we can start peeling away some of those really, really bad problems. So we're the folks who are working in the mobile home parks and in the underserved and overburdened communities. And that fourth wall, like I said, is connecting these movements to where people are. Really, because, the title of this workshop is very, very fitting, because most folks who are consumers of water are exactly there. Can we fish in it? Can we swim in it? Can we drink it? They don't really care about the PowerPoint presentations and the strategy stuff and government programs. And I admit there's a certain skepticism that either corporate money or government action is ultimately going to clean up your watershed for you. Citizens have a big role to play in kicking the system in the pants, in asking really good questions, and in carrying forth these campaigns that really bring justice, right? Justice for the water way, justice for people, justice for communities, as much as these are movements that have saddled environmental justice almost as an afterthought. The truth is, all of these endeavors are really about creating a sense of justice surrounding something that is really pivotal. Water is either clean or it's not. It's not a little bit clean, it's not sort of clean, it's either clean or it's not. We don't get extra points for getting water with a C- water quality grade. So it's a different take, I think, because I do believe that citizens need to own these successes. The citizens themselves are what give momentum, is what gives moral authority to these cause movements that we're involved with. And the moral authority of connecting these movements to the outsiders is huge, right? Because they're much more authentic movements, they're better movements, they're richer movements. Actually, they're unstoppable movements to the extent that we have really strong engagement from the people who have not generally been included. So I'll leave it at that for now, but that's essentially what Patuxent Riverkeeper is about. I will say I think I'm now the longest serving riverkeeper in the Chesapeake Bay region, which I guess means I ought to retire. but that's a perspective too. I've seen a lot, and I've seen where these movements have been, and I have some ideas about where they need to go. Thank you.
All right. Marel, you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Marel King. I'm the Pennsylvania director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, and I guess I'm one of the insiders on the other end of the spectrum from the outsiders, so to speak, the on-the-ground folks. But our commission members, our state legislators, state agency secretaries primarily, from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. We're a 21-member commission, and we focus on legislation primarily, other state and federal policy, and budgets, fiscal policy for how to get Chesapeake Bay restoration on track and moving forward. So the commission has been in existence now for over 40 years. One of our earliest members was Maryland Senator Bernie Fowler from the Patuxent River, and it was his love of the Patuxent, you're exactly right, that helped in many ways to push the greater Chesapeake Bay restoration forward. And 40 years later, we can look back and we can see that the population of the Bay watershed, 64,000 square miles, parts of 6 states plus the District of Columbia. It's one of the growing regions of the country. Now over 18 million people. The population has grown by half in those 40 years since the commission was started, but the pollution to the Bay has been reduced by 1/3. So we like to think we're doing more than just holding the line, but we're actually making progress in the face of that growth. And where we have to go moving forward is actually really a story of the Clean Water Act, because most of that progress, the reduction by 1/3, has really come from the point source sector, wastewater treatment plants primarily. And it's been through the NPDES process, the TMDL process, that has really helped to move that sector toward those pollution reductions. Where we're struggling and where the remaining loads need to come from, over 80% of remaining nitrogen phosphorus loads that we need to reduce, those reductions need to come from the agricultural sector, a non-point source, which don't have, short of a CAFO, don't have an NPDES permit, is looked more as a voluntary and an incentive-based program. And so where we are right now is trying to figure out how to provide really the resources at scale to get their level of reductions that we need.
All right. Thank you. Okay, Kirsten, if you can hear me, do you want to go next?
Yes, would be happy to, and great to join you all for this discussion, although virtually, wish I could be there in the room. But again, my name is Kirsten James, and I'm the Senior Director leading the water program at CERES. For those of you who might not be familiar with us, we're a sustainability organization advancing leadership among investors, companies, and other capital market influencers to really drive solutions and take action on the world's most pressing sustainability issues. So we were actually founded over 30 years ago now, back in 1989, in response to the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and a group of concerned investors really started to recognize that there's a financial risk, if you aren't really managing, issues and circumstances that could lead to environmental degradation. And so, for the past 30 plus years, we've really approached a number of sustainability challenges, really with what I see as quite a unique theory of change, where we're making the financial business case for sustainability to investors, to companies, to policymakers, to regulators, among others. So, in terms of my journey to get to CERES, I've been based in Los Angeles for some time now, where both water scarcity and water quality issues really are front and center. I first came to LA to work at a regional nonprofit focused on water pollution and ocean conservation issues and the link between them. So obviously very relevant to the discussion today. And the organization got its start really because pollution from one of the world's largest wastewater treatment plants was discharging barely treated water into the Santa Monica Bay and really creating a massive dead zone. So, over time, thankfully, the facility was upgraded, but as some of the fellow panelists noted, there's many other, challenges, beyond the point sources that really need to be addressed. And, there was definitely much more to do also with urban runoff and stormwater issues, creating huge water quality issues in our local waterways, and much of that pollution heading out to the ocean. So that continues to be a huge challenge for us in Los Angeles. And then about 8 years ago, I joined CERES, first leading a program focused in California, given the extensive droughts we've been seeing in our state, and really the lack of progress on things like groundwater management. We developed a program to work with businesses around advocacy for public policies that focused on smart water management. So we were able to make some really, big inroads, bringing those business voices to the state capitol, really advocating for sustainable water management. CERES has seen success working with companies on policy advocacy on the climate space, so we brought this work to focus on water. And then fast forward to present day. Currently, as mentioned, I lead our water program, where our focus is really on building investor and business leadership to protect freshwater supplies around the globe. And again, we help make that business case to companies and investors around how and why they must act on water issues, or jeopardize the financial bottom line. So that's CERES and my background in a nutshell. And thanks again for having me to join this discussion today.
All right, thanks, Kirsten. All right, and finally, Dr. Leonard, if you can hear me, do you want to provide some remarks?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
There we go. Hello, good day, everyone. As was mentioned, I'm Dr. Kelsey Leonard. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Waters, Climate and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, but I also am an enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation, located on the east end of Long Island, New York, and serve with the Mid-Atlantic Committee on the Ocean. So in my research and scientific program, we're really looking at what does it take for communities and our global society to be able to adapt to our changing climate, to adapt to the current crisis. And I think oftentimes we're calling it the climate crisis, but we don't have a crisis in climate, we have a crisis in humans. Humans are the problem, and that is really when we think about water, when we think about the Clean Water Act, when we think about where we are 50 years later, when we think about what the future of our planet looks like, it really is imperative upon us to prioritize addressing our human issues and our human problems around overconsumption and really what is gluttony and entitlement and privilege. And I think if we can start there, and if we can start to operate from, in a lot of Indigenous teachings, operate from a position of love, and restoring our connection to nature, restoring our connection to water, it would really start to see some of the critical advancements we need for planetary health and well-being. Unfortunately, I don't know that we are at that stage yet where humanity is willing to sacrifice to be able to give nature the chance it needs to restore itself. But I'm hopeful that we can get there, and a testament to my co-panelists who are already leading in that charge. So thank you, and I appreciate being here with you all today.
All right, great. So all of the speakers hit on a couple of themes that I want to talk about in the moderated discussion, and we'll start with something that I think everybody touched on, which is non-point source pollution. So I'll start with you, Kelly, and everybody should feel free to weigh in on this. So how, from your perspective, can we make greater progress in controlling non-point source pollution? And think about, what collaborative partnerships have worked, and how can we leverage new and existing funding programs across the government to move the needle?
That is a great question, and one of the biggest issues facing the Mississippi River is nutrient pollution, primarily from agriculture, and it causes the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which we haven't really gotten to make progress on. So I think one of the things that would really help is to have some measurable goals to know if we are making progress. I think a struggle with non-point source pollution is that it is more challenging to measure. There are a lot of great programs, like Farm Bill conservation programs, that help with agriculture applications that, and in the Midwest where I'm from, are routinely oversubscribed. So I think one of the solutions could be more funding for conservation programs. As you know, Mike, we have the Gulf Hypoxia Task Force, and each state has a nutrient reduction plan. I think it would be great if those plans had a little bit more teeth, and I'm excited about the influx in spending to see how that plays out, and maybe those plans having some more teeth. I think there's a lot of also just, farming applications that can happen, more cover crops, continuous living cover, that would really benefit.
All right. Marel, from the Chesapeake Bay perspective?
So as I said, most of the nitrogen and phosphorus reductions that the Bay needs going forward have to come from agriculture at this point. And just as you said, it's about those best management practices, whether it's cover crops or no-till or manure storage or those kinds of things. It's not necessarily a gray infrastructure solution, but it's a green infrastructure solution for agriculture. And those are supported through those Farm Bill cost share programs, through the National Resources Conservation Service. It's from the technical assistance that the planners and engineers in those NRCS offices provide. It's the same kind of support that comes through our county soil and water conservation districts that work with the farmers at the very local level. It's also state cost share programs. Maryland and Virginia have very robust state cost share programs for agriculture, and they have made more progress than Pennsylvania has, which has not a very robust state agricultural cost share program. That's something that in Pennsylvania we're hitting our peak budget negotiation time right now in Pennsylvania, and that is one of our number one priorities, is getting a much more robust agricultural cost share program within the state, because the state programs and the federal programs have different requirements. They can match each other, they can provide matching funds, and having the soil and water districts and the USDA staff working together in that partnership, along with the NGOs. I can't forget the important role that the NGO community plays in this as well. They're out there applying for grants and some of these other funding sources that are available, again, to help fill out that funding puzzle. Because absent an NPDES permit for a farm, it takes that technical assistance and that sort of individual work, site by site, farm by farm, to get those practices in place. And because there are so many farms, in Pennsylvania's part of the watershed alone, there are over 33,000 farms. To have those individual relationships and get that work done site by site by site by site takes not only the implementation funding, but the technical assistance support as well.
All right. Fred, what are you seeing on the ground? What's your perspective?
So I learned very early on in this work. I think the first construction site I walked onto when I became a riverkeeper in 2004, where all the best management practices are being followed and the surrounding receiving waters are being destroyed. And I asked the state regulator if this site was in compliance, and he said, as well as can be expected. Now, mind you, I came from a profession where I made films and other things about nuclear power plant safety and stuff. If somebody told me a nuclear power plant is performing as well as can be expected, it doesn't really reassure me. I think the truth is, sometimes we need a lot more than best management practices. It is not widely known, but Patuxent Riverkeeper was really the moving force behind changing the Maryland State Stormwater Manual, which we incidentally ripped off from New Jersey substantially. A lot of it in the Maryland Code actually came from New Jersey, where there was something approaching a performance basis. In other words, either it works or it doesn't. If it doesn't work, we correct it. Right now, we have a very permissive regulatory scheme, at least we do in Maryland. I can't speak for Virginia. My river doesn't go to Virginia or any of the other Bay states. But the idea that something very site-specific is going on, and while you might be applying the best management practices, I mean, how many of us have been past a construction site that had plenty of silt fencing that just isn't doing the job? And yet the silt fencing alone is the best management practices that assures that this site is in regulatory compliance, at least legally. So it's not enough to just apply kind of boilerplate best management practices. The reason we do that, I think, is because the same jurisdictions that regulate stormwater and non-point pollution and all that are also charged with protecting the construction industry, so that they have a menu of choices to choose from where they have assurance that the practices they're following will get them the maximum return on their investment. Actually, courts really should be arguing they should get reasonable return, but they like maximum return. That's good for business. So I do think we have to approach these problems very, very differently, because we end up with this paradox between everyone's following all the rules and the water is still dying. That's crazy. That's crazy talk. It doesn't make sense, but it's true. So I do think we have to approach the design culture very differently, not just the regulatory culture, but how we go about designing these projects such that they have a lower tolerance for destroying the surrounding community and waters from being in compliance. I mean, I think it's not an unusual phenomenon at all. I bet you everyone in the audience has probably seen that phenomena. Mm-hmm. It's perfectly compliant, and yet it's still a mess.
All right, I don't know if we lost Kirsten. All right. Well, let's just take off on that point you made, and I'll put this question to Kelsey, which is, think differently. What do our goals look like? Should we, Kelsey, be thinking differently about water quality goals, about water quality planning due to climate change?
Whoops. Looks like we lost a mic.
Don't have her mic. All right. I think we have some technical difficulties, so I'll put that back to the panel then. Should we be thinking, and anybody could jump in here, differently about water quality planning and our goals in the face of climate change?
Well, in the Bay watershed, we are looking forward in anticipation of what the additional reductions needed are going to be. Under the TMDL for Chesapeake Bay right now, those loads are not currently factored in, but we have calculated them at least out to 2025, and there's ongoing work to calculate them out to 2035 with the understanding that there's more that will need to be done in the face of increased temperatures, not only air temperature, but water temperature, increased flow due to precipitation through our major tributaries, which will create more runoff. We understand that even if we meet our current TMDL goal, we're not going to be done. We do have to look forward. And I think it was already brought up about monitoring and looking in the water itself is super important, and that's the question that we're hearing right now all the time. We have these modeled or these sort of anticipated reductions when you do something, but what is the actual water telling us, and can we enhance significantly our monitoring network to be gathering all of that information, not just what we're doing now, but the trends that we're seeing in the face of climate change as well.
Let me check if Kelsey or Kirsten are back on and they want to weigh in.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Go ahead, Kirsten. So we're talking about non-point
All right.
source.
I think I missed some of the discussion, but I think you were interested in sort of how we address non-point sources. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then a little bit taking that further, how should we be thinking differently about our goals in the face of climate change?
Yeah, well, I think to maybe address both of those at the same time. So, from the CERES point of view, we really need to see companies with those deep agricultural supply chains step up and do much more to mitigate the water impacts that we're seeing. So, some data points, every 2 years, CERES releases a benchmark of the top food and beverage companies based on their water management efforts. This is called Feeding Ourselves Thirsty. You can find all of the data on our website. And in our latest report, only 18 of the companies, so less than half of those that we analyzed, performed risk assessments that focused on their agricultural supply chain. And this, as you can imagine, really is a crucial foundational step in creating a robust management strategy. So, a pretty disappointing data point. We are seeing an uptick in trends over time, but still less than half are doing this basic step. So, we do see some bright spots, and hopefully we can learn from and emulate these. For example, just one program to mention, CERES and WWF released the Ag Water Challenge, where we encourage companies to step up on water management practices in their supply chain and really go to their suppliers and work with their suppliers, work with their growers to make some of these commitments that my fellow panelists have talked about in terms of soil health practices that can support crop productivity, reduce erosion, and many other co-benefits. So through this program, we have some great examples of companies stepping up to the plate. Mars, for example, a global food company that many of you are familiar with, and also a pet care company. They committed to sustainable ag practices on over 40,000 acres for their rice supply chain in the US and Spain, and really providing incentives for suppliers and farmers and education for those growers and farmers. So, that's just one example. We are, seeing, some bright spots, but we need much more of that. And CERES is definitely working to do that. In terms of climate change, I think, we just need to be, really bolder and faster in our work. I think that's the bottom line. The water crisis is at our doorstep, and climate change is just exacerbating the problem. So we really need to focus on multi-benefit solutions that really protect our water resources at the same time as creating resiliency for future climate scenarios. So at CERES, we're trying to, think bolder, think, broader in scope. And so I can talk more about that later in the conversation. We just launched a Valuing Water Finance initiative where we're hoping to scale and scope our efforts with investors of companies really stepping up and diving into those agricultural supply chain issues that I just mentioned.
Great. Check Kelsey if she has audio again.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to echo what my co-panelists have already shared, and I think as well with the Patuxent River Keeper. What we have currently within our legal system is we have a process by which we legalize the destruction of nature, and we legalize the destruction of rivers. And we do so up to a certain threshold where the water is still just good enough that humans can still benefit from its consumption and overuse. And so I think if we're trying to plan for the future that we need, we really need to reevaluate that system of law. And we're starting to see that occur through different types of jurisdictions passing different forms of rights of nature initiatives. We saw the recognition of the Klamath River by the Yurok tribe. We saw different initiatives that have gone through to try and recognize the legal personality of the Great Lakes. A new piece of legislation went up through the New York State legislature this year in recent months. And we're also seeing, even in New York State and other states, advancements in green amendments to our state constitutions to really say that we have a right to a healthy environment. And I think it's also not just us as human beings, but that the environment itself, the water itself, has a right to be healthy, to thrive, and to flourish. And our status quo of allowing for the legalized destruction of nature and rivers for over a decade and over a century in some instances, we need to reevaluate that, and we need to transform to be able to create new laws that actually allow for protection and for the maintenance of well-being of that ecosystem above all else, and really start to dismantle the human superiority complex that we have, because ultimately it's leading to our destruction and to the destruction of the planet. We are in the Anthropocene, and that is defined by humans having the most damaging activity on our planet that we've ever seen in a geologic age. So we could be doing a lot more.
Great. Fred or Kelly, you guys want to weigh in on the climate change question?
Me too.
Yeah, I absolutely think we need to be thinking more boldly, and just, climate change is going to make hypoxia worse. It's going to make harmful algal blooms worse. There have only been 10 studies in total done to know what the impacts of harmful algal blooms in this more toxic climate change impact on marine life. So yeah, we just need to be thinking a lot more boldly.
Can I just say, we as environmentalists, as conservationists, we're really unfunny, unsympathetic sometimes, and we're really pills. We don't really put our message across as well as we might. And so I don't think sometimes people want to see us coming, because we're eager to tell people how to live, how to do this, how to do that. And the truth is, we have to find some way to make these ideas and ourselves much more simpatico. I've experimented with how to make environmentalists funny, well, why did the chicken cross the road? There was a stormwater outfall on the other side. I just can't make it work. So I do believe that while the future of the planet and the future of water is at stake, we still have got to find some way, like I said, it's that fourth wall. We really have to find a way to connect with people, and spiritually, or however we connect with them, we connect with them on their terms, not necessarily ours. So this message of climate change is not really resonating out there sometimes. People don't want to hear it. Granted, they need to hear it. We need to get better at telling that story.
All right. Well, let's talk about communities connecting with people. And I want to talk about environmental justice a little bit, and in particular, equity and inclusion. This is something that's really important to the program I run at EPA. How do we bring more communities into the Nonpoint source management program? What is needed to help communities and stakeholders equitably benefit from clean water and programs and policies? And how do we better engage the underserved, the overburdened communities in water quality planning and restoration? So anybody want to pick up on that one? Go ahead, maybe Fred, if you want to continue here.
Sure. So we've walked that walk very intensively at Patuxent Riverkeeper. We listen very closely to communities. We spend more time listening than we do talking. And it drives me nuts to hear water advocates say, well, I'm the local expert on water. I hear that in Waterkeeper sometimes. Like, well, who says? Or we're the leading environmentalists in the state. That's another one I hear. Sometimes like, well, whom are we leading? So I do think we have to get a little better at listening and get over ourselves because we don't have all the answers. And we're not always the local experts, because there are local people and communities that are very connected to the problems that we're trying to solve. And we need their insight and support, but we need to be on their bandwagon as much as we need them on ours. I guess that's the simplest. And it sounds simplistic, but it is kind of simple. I mean, sometimes it's hard to listen because we've got funding to do a certain thing, and the listening doesn't quite connect to the thing we're already funded to do. It's a different problem, but it's a real one. So I do think that we have to work a lot harder at listening and responding to communities. I use the term moral authority, which I know sounds very high-minded, but the truth is we don't have any business telling these communities what to do unless we stand in their shoes, and unless we're empowering these communities to fight these battles. That's durable work, right? The work that sticks around when the grants are gone and when we retire, that's the work worth doing. And I think that's work that communities have to own. We have to work harder at letting communities own both the solutions right, to these problems as much as the problems. So I know that's glossy. I know it sounds very idealistic, but it's true. It's real.
All right. Marel, how do we help communities own the issues?
Beg pardon?
It's Marel. How do we help communities?
Well, it gets back to listening and focusing on what matters to a community. Chesapeake Bay, 18 million people, 6 states plus DC. It is way too abstract for the average Bay watershed citizen to connect with that at all. In Pennsylvania, we try to bring it down at least to the Susquehanna River level, and that, is too big for, folks to really wrap their arms around. With, this March to 2025, the deadline that we're facing currently for the Bay TMDL, our latest round of watershed implementation plans in Pennsylvania has gone down to the county level. So yes, we have the statewide plan, which we've had before, but now we have individual county level plans where there was an enormous amount of public engagement of, okay, you, Lancaster County, York County, Cumberland County, any of the 43 counties in Pennsylvania that are within the Bay watershed, what are your goals for water quality locally? And how can we sort of merge these two efforts together and leverage these two efforts together? And that has made an enormous difference in local buy-in. But in Pennsylvania, it has to get even more local than that. And in a few different counties, there's something now underway called a local stream delisting project. So in Pennsylvania, they've assessed streams down to the very small segment, like half mile, quarter mile segment, and, that particular segment attaining, not attaining. And they've done even further analysis, thanks to some of the work going on within the Chesapeake Conservancy, another NGO partner, to then analyze, okay, so you have an impaired stream, and 1/3 of our local Pennsylvania streams are impaired. So it's not just about the Bay, and that's the other message we try to take. But find us some streams that are on the verge of moving from non-attaining to attaining. And let's just, go all in, do the work, fix it up, and show folks that if you do the work, the water quality will follow. And instead of this, sort of shotgun approach where we're just kind of throwing money at whoever will take it across the watershed, it's all good, it all makes progress, but it's so diffuse that it's hard to see the results at the end of the day. And by going into this very, hyper-local focus, we're hopeful that we'll start to, tick some of those segments off of the 303D list, and that will start to snowball, and the momentum and the enthusiasm among the public will sort of feed on itself. And we're just at the beginning of that, but we're very hopeful. And the data, the monitoring data, the GIS, hydrologic data, all of that coming together has been very helpful. We just need more of it, especially that monitoring data.
Yeah. So, Kirsten, what's the role of industry in working with government and local communities to kind of bridge that gap in knowledge that the speakers have been talking about?
Yeah, well, I think, the private sector needs to really see the community as a critical stakeholder when they're, making a change in their practices or when they're coming into a community. So through our work with the private sector, we really emphasize the critical importance of engaging with the local community around water issues and planning. This is critical, for having a solid, informed plan that actually is going to succeed. But also, as we've seen, it's also critical for maintaining the company's social license to operate. And we've seen instances where, the private sector does not do this, and they really see the repercussions, the negative repercussions. For example, there's been instances of beverage companies coming into communities and draining groundwater supplies or polluting various water supplies. Recently in Mexico, there was a brewery that was planned and community protests arose because the brewery didn't really, in our view, appropriately reach out to the community and bring them into some of the planning and decision making. And so now that brewery is faced with an enormous stranded asset in that community because the political leaders put the brakes on that. So you can see the repercussions if the community isn't engaged, and to really ensure that an effective solution set is in place, you really need the community as a critical stakeholder. And then of course, the private sector also, we're seeing some important examples of the private sector engaging in access to water and sanitation issues. So that's definitely something that is becoming more front and center for the private sector and for investors, really helping to work in the communities that they're operating or where their supply chains touch to ensure that the community has access to clean water and sanitation. And worldwide, about 2.1 billion people do not have access to safe drinking water. So that has been a focus as well. There's a number of great examples. Gap Inc., for example, has partnered with USAID on a Woman in Water program and really helping to bring in those local perspectives and to help train and accelerate best practices in those communities. So we're seeing some promising examples, but really this inclusion needs to become common practice.
Yeah, I just want to give Kelsey a chance to weigh in and maybe talk about the unique role that tribes and nations play in local water quality planning and management.
Yeah, well, I think the short answer to that is tribes are sovereign and they control their water resources and they control the management of those waters. And oftentimes, if you look across the United States as a whole, tribal nations often have the most stringent water quality standards, even above those of federal standards. So I think that is indicative of our relationship to water and the way in which our value system differs often very significantly from the other American communities and societies. I do want to take a step back on the environmental justice question in terms of water management and water governance in the United States. We don't have a data problem with monitoring of biophysical components of water. We have a data problem in managing environmental racism components and environmental justice components. We're not tracking and measuring what we need to be able to properly assess which communities are being disproportionately overburdened by water impairments. And so that is something that when we look at this administration, when we look at where we need to move forward, we need to be adequately tracking and collecting the data to have the information necessary to know which communities are being overtaxed and overburdened, and then hopefully to be able to work to stop that. This isn't rocket science. Stop making it so that some communities are overburdened and disproportionately burdened by impaired water and by degraded water. We have communities across the United States. Most are familiar with Flint, but we've had communities across New Jersey, New York, all around the East Coast and all parts of the United States that do not have access to clean water to meet their daily livelihood needs. And that's a really, really small fraction of how other Americans get to use water. So it's terrific, that we are one of the world's wealthiest countries and we still allow for American citizens to not have access to clean water. And when we think about industry, when we think about, other players, even just other citizens that are able to turn on their tap and not have to ask questions about whether or not what's coming out is clean, that is a stance of privilege. And we have to start to dismantle a lot of the privilege that exists across our society and make sure that when we're talking about these concerns around environmental justice, that we're actually talking about ensuring that children, that young people, that future generations have an opportunity to be able to live healthy lives. And to live lives that are free from concerns about whether or not when they turn on their tap, they're going to get a rash they're going to get sickness, or they have enough water to put in the formula that we've had a shortage of to feed their babies. These are really basic concerns that some of our American society has to deal with on a daily basis. And others don't even, it's never crossed their mind. And so that is a grave injustice that we have to work to address. We can do that by collecting better data to ensure that we're monitoring the way in which communities are being disproportionately overburdened, and then actually do something about it. I'm tired of listening sessions. I'm tired of, let's hear from the stakeholders. That's not doing anything anymore. We need to actually create policies and procedures in place where you tell companies, where you tell projects that they need to stop. And they need to stop continually to put these projects into communities that have already been disproportionately overburdened. So that is where we need to move forward in terms of the future of protecting waters across the United States.
Thank you, Kelsey. And I think that's one of the really exciting things about the infrastructure law and the investment in clean water that comes with that. So, and this administration's focus on environmental justice. So I want to move now to questions from the audience. And this first one is builds on young people. And so the first question is, because the future is in the hands of the youth in my generation, how have you all planned for youth engagement and education on these topics of water quality and overall climate change? And Kelly, do you want to take the first shot at that?
Sure. I will say in terms of our organization, we don't do like environmental education, but our members do to like youth. But I think, and that's more of like a grant nonprofit grant issue. So we won't go into that topic. But I think one of the things, we do in our One Mississippi program that is educating, and it is aimed at wanting to engage youth to know about the problems and the solutions to those problems facing the Mississippi River. But really, and this speaks to some of the things that have been brought up, also with more of an emphasis on values and meeting people where they are. And so things that youth may care about, understanding that the climate crisis and all those impacts really are much more scary when you're a young person, because your future does not feel as stable as those of us on the stage. It's scary to me. And so I think that, those are some of the ways our organization is trying to engage youth. And just, internally our culture is that anybody can be a leader, that you don't have to have a certain title, you don't have to have a certain education, you don't have to have a certain pedigree, that we are all leaders and should be empowered to protect our communities and the things we're passionate about.
Fred, you want to weigh in on this?
So an anecdote. So the first few weeks we started, when we first started Patuxent Riverkeeper, we were in the old office that I had when I ran a media company. Actually, we just folded the lease over to the nonprofit, and all of a sudden we're no longer the old media company, we're Patuxent Riverkeeper. And the FedEx guy who used to come and deliver stuff noticed there was a real difference in the types of packages he was delivering. It was no longer electronic equipment and other kinds of stuff. It was stuff that related to waters. And he said, well, what do you guys do? And I told him we were in a watershed protection group. And he said, Dag, he said, I didn't think white people let us do that. And that taught me an interesting lesson. First, I was shocked, like, wow. This guy's waiting for authorization to do something. But more importantly, the presumption that the space is claimed and that the experts don't happen to be people of color. And granted, I know we're talking about youth, but I think youth is where you build those ideas too. What the expectations are, what you can grow up to be, what you can attain, what you can shoot for. So we have a backer that's provided us with support to create a summer camp. We're just starting the first year this year. And we're putting particular emphasis on putting mentorship into this watershed that comes from people who look like the people we're trying to reach. Right? If we're teaching kids to fish, then, I've got nothing against people who don't happen to be people of color, who know how to fish, but I know pretty well there are plenty of people of color out there who know how to teach other people how to fish as well, and so on and so on. So one of the ways we do that, I think, is by changing the paradigms about who's who and what you can aspire to and what you can work on. Because I've had to ask myself that question too. When I went to a speech about the first African-American woman who climbed Mount Everest, I had to ask myself, why is that important? And I think it's important because it says that we can do this. It sets the new norm. So we have to change the norms too. I think that's hugely important because that makes bigger, richer movements as well.
All right. Move to another question here. Maybe Marel, you want to take this one to start, which is, given that we will still need to do more after meeting our TMDL and other goals, should we be setting bigger scope goals or benchmark goals? Do you think benchmark goals will be as effective or tire people out from constantly needing to do more?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we're so focused right now on 2025 that at this point, the things like climate change and adding more and more, and there's a Conowingo load out there that we won't even talk about today. And yeah, the instinct is to just set that aside because this is a big enough hurdle for us to get over right now. Let's focus on this. That said, there is some discussion moving forward about rethinking how we calculate those goals and what exactly we are shooting for. Just for example, our TMDL is based on all 92 segments of the Chesapeake Bay eventually attaining water quality standards. That means the very deepest part of the deep channel main stem bay. There's some discussion going on right now about, do we, really need to look at that right now? Can't we just, as I said before, that local engagement and thinking about, what really resonates with folks, maybe we should be focused on some of the more shallower areas and just getting them in attainment and off the list, real progress that folks can see, real progress. They can, fish in those areas, they can go crabbing in those areas, they can recreate in those areas that mean something to people. And maybe, going forward, we think about, how we calculate our goals, what we're shooting for, and when we have those expectations of attainment. But those are just discussions right now.
All right. So this one is specifically for Kirsten. It's a two-part question. So the first part is, could you talk about the changes in attitudes towards sustainable action, corporate environmental impacts amongst the companies that you have conversation with, if any? And then secondly, how do you engage with investors, companies that are reluctant to listen?
Yeah, great question. So I think, there's definitely positive trends out there in terms of corporate sustainability. As I mentioned before, CERES has placed a lot of focus on the food and beverage sector because of their sort of oversized impact on water resources. And so we've been tracking in 4 iterations of a benchmarking report where we track progress over time. And, we are seeing some promising trends on just some of the general foundational aspects of corporate water management. And so we are, seeing companies start to take notice. However, as we talked about with climate change and the water crisis really being at our doorstep, that's not good enough. So we really need to scale all of the work and get companies to step up, especially when it comes to their supply chains. Companies tend to be more focused on their operations and those point sources, but we're seeing so much of the impact within the supply chain. So we really need to see more focus in that realm. So some positive trends, but not good enough. So how do we approach that then? Getting to your second question, what if, a company is still lagging behind, or, there's definitely companies out there that still are scoring, unfortunately, 0 out of 100 points on our benchmark. And so how do we approach those companies? And so, that's really where the investors come in. So the investors, as shareholders or owners of these companies, really have a lot of ability to motivate companies when there is a perceived financial risk. And so, you see droughts and floods, in real time impacting companies and impacting their access to clean water supplies. And this is a financial risk to these companies and to their investors. And so, we at CERES really work with coalitions of investors to really mobilize and advocate for companies that they own to move on these issues. So one example for something that actually we'll be releasing a report on Thursday, so keep your eyes out. CERES and our partners in the UK, a group called FAIR, have partnered with 90 investors representing $11 trillion in assets under management. So quite a substantial investor coalition. And this coalition is focused on the 6 leading fast food companies, brands we all know and eat, Chipotle, Wendy's, among others. And what they're really focused on in these engagements with these companies is pushing them to really manage their agricultural supply chains, and specifically their meat and dairy supply chains. Because speaking of non-point sources from earlier in the conversation, the water impacts, from the meat industry are staggering. And so the investors are working with these companies, pushing them to make commitments, pushing them to take action within their meat sourcing. The companies have a lot of power over their suppliers. And so, again, the progress is slow. And so we need more investors and we need more companies to step up to the plate. But we are seeing, some good signs of progress. We just need, more to come on that.
Thanks, Kirsten. All right, this one's for Kelly. What part of agriculture does nutrient pollution come from, and what actions will reduce this pollution?
So there's, mentioning earlier kind of a systems thinking approach. So I think a lot of people think that the agricultural pollution is from over fertilizing your crops. So what helps them grow when you have too much of that then ends up running off. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the biggest problems in terms of nutrients that become excessive and cause water quality issues. But it really isn't actually, most of the problem is not farmers actually applying too much fertilizer. Farmers want to do things in an economically smart way. It is really because of so many practices that have degraded the soil health and also the transition to monocrops. In the Midwest, we grow corn and we grow soy, and we have shallow root systems that are not able to hold on to that fertilizer. The soil cannot hold on to that fertilizer. Another practice that's really common in the Midwest and exacerbates nutrient pollution is tiling farms. So that was to help have the water drain off farms quickly. Now so many farms are tiled that the soil doesn't even hold that water, and it just runs right off the farm, goes into your unregulated ditch, goes into the tributary, goes into well waters, causing public health issues, and then goes into the Mississippi. So that is, I think that answers the question.
That's a good answer. All right, this one's specifically for Fred. What is Patuxent Riverkeeper doing about point source pollution and collaborating with local businesses and communities regarding wastewater treatment?
So we have 36 wastewater treatment plants on the Patuxent, and it's a 110-mile river. So you do the math. There's a lot of, when I first took this job, people said there wouldn't be much water in that river at all if people stopped flushing their toilets. So there's hardly a day when one of those plants, some of them incidentally state-owned, aren't having some kind of incident or some kind of a leak or a spill. We have 4 wastewater treatment plants currently being investigated by the EPA, all co-owned by the same source, that are discharging raw solids, and have been rather since the pandemic. So sewage and wastewater, point source in particular, is a big deal on the Patuxent River. We sue, we file notices of intent, we investigate. We, incidentally, last month had a whistleblower in one of those plants actually prosecuted for trespassing to take water samples. Now, mind you, it was a plant not submitting its required NPDES reports. Nobody would know this plant was out of compliance if somebody hadn't hopped a fence and gone and taken water samples at their own expense. It didn't help that the defendant's name was Crook. Actually, can you imagine being in court trying to argue that Mr. Crook is innocent? The case was dismissed, thankfully. We're grateful for that. But I will say we're pretty vigilant about working on this. I can't say that we collaborate much with local businesses on point source issues. Most of these are regulated industries, and I do believe you have to regulate capitalism. I don't think you convince it, you regulate it, and you hold the line. That's vitally important. If you can't say the words capitalism, you sure as heck can't fight it. And there are lots of institutions that can't fight capitalism because that's what funds them. I think we are independent from that establishment. That is why we've been able to fight the right fights. So that's about as much of a point I can put on it. We're rather vigorous and vigilant about going after the known point sources we can find. We run a list we call the 10 worst polluters in the Patuxent. And when we retire one of them, we add another, because there's plenty to work with. There's 3 lifetimes worth of work on this river, on the Patuxent River, for people to do. So there it is.
All right. Okay, sorry I'm not able to get to everybody's questions, but I appreciate everybody submitting them. We're going to switch to the final part of this panel, which is the lightning round. I'm going to ask each panelist in 1 minute or less. You can do it in haiku if you want. What is the one thing you want the audience to take away from this session? And let's start with Kelsey on the screen.
Wonderful. Hopefully you can hear me. We've had some audio issues.
Yep.
I would say one thing to take away is to find your path for restoring your connection to water. We all are born with a connection to water, but somewhere along the way, a lot of us have lost that connection. And so that may be finding out where your water comes from, not just from your tap. It may be going to a local water source, just finding a way to connect with water. And I think if you're able to do that, it's a great place to start building an ethic of love for care and stewardship that we all need for planetary healing.
All right, Kirsten?
Great. Well, I would just, restate, industry needs to be a critical stakeholder if we're going to, protect our water resources. Collectively, they're the largest user and influencer of our fresh water globally. And they obviously have a lot to lose without a sustainable supply of water. So industry really needs to be at the table and stepping up if we're going to address our water issues. So we need to be bolder. We need the private sector at the table. And we're hopeful that the work CERES is doing with companies and investors can help move the ball on these issues. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Marel?
Engage with your local elected officials, whether that's the municipal level, at the state level, at the congressional level. If this is an issue that's important to you, make sure that they know that and keep at it. And it's not just advocacy on specific issues, putting out fires as they come up, but regular ongoing engagement. If you're involved in an NGO, what your group is doing. If you're a farmer or within the business community and you want them to know what you're doing regarding water quality or how these issues affect you, engage with that. If you're in government and you want them to understand how these programs actually work or don't work, that information is very important too. Just that regular, open, honest communication with your elected officials.
Great. Fred?
So Marel graciously mentioned Senator Bernie Fowler at the beginning of this. So Bernie passed away at the age of 97 this past fall. I'd like to say that the memorial, which was postponed, is this weekend. So if you're in the DC area, Calvert High School, on Saturday there's a memorial, and on Sunday the first Chesapeake wade-in that has ever occurred in, 30 years, without Bernie in person and present. Bernie was a powerful influence, the power of one man, who really put a bright idea, a brilliant idea out there and fought for it for, I can't say 97 years, but most of those 97. I don't think he was fighting from cradle to grave. And I will say that his favorite saying about it is outdated because he was of a generation that knew who Winston Churchill was. I would be surprised if kids don't have to go look up who Winston Churchill is now. But his saying was, never, 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 I think it's 5 nevers, give up. But I must point out one thing further. I learned recently something that really knocked me on my butt. Apparently, the wade-ins that Bernie's been doing, these harmonic convergences where he marches into the water that he's credited with, some people even call them Fowler wade-ins. I learned that it came from the Piscataways, that the head of the Piscataway Nation gave to Tom Wisner, the board of Art of the Bay, please tell Bernie to start doing wade-ins. Now, how many people from the indigenous community, you think, would come to these wade-ins if they knew that this came from the Piscataways? We have to, again, bring the outsiders in, right? The outsiders who should have been insiders. The wade-ins aren't Bernie's, and I think Bernie would have graciously conceded that they belong to all of us. And so that's, I think, the message I'd like to leave with people. These should be every man, every woman, every person movements. And the wade-in is exactly that kind of event where we need to recognize those connections that exist within these watersheds that don't belong to one group or any sole interest group, but belong to all of us. Never, 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 never give up.
All right, Kelly, last word.
Yeah, I have to agree with Fred. We need to be working, and as someone running a coalition, not surprising, in coalition and collaborate together. And I just really love this quote and think it speaks very much to the moment. We need every solution and every solver. To change everything, we need everyone. What this moment calls for is a mosaic of voices, the full spectrum of ideas and insights for how we can turn things around. And that's from All We Can Save.
All right, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And it's great because technology allowed us to have 2 remote speakers. So thank you so much also for joining us online. It's my real pleasure to welcome Representative Jenniffer González Colón of Puerto Rico, who is the new co-chair of the House Oceans Caucus, to close the panel for us. Thank you, Congresswoman.
Good afternoon, and thank you, everybody, for having me. And I was here in the panel backstage, so thank you for your efforts as well. And I would like to say that I would like to thank the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for just inviting me to deliver some remarks in this incredible forum on importance of water quality and watershed management for our oceans, coasts, and freshwater systems. And what can I say? I'm coming from Puerto Rico, so we are surrounded by our oceans and facing a lot of the challenges that you were just mentioned here. And I'm particularly honored to be joining you during this Capitol Hill Ocean Week as a new co-chair of the House Ocean Caucus, and I am humbled to be trying to fill in the role of formerly held by my friend and mentor, the late Congressman Don Young from Alaska. I'm looking forward to trying to build on that legacy, but I understand that improving water quality must be a vital component of any effort to protect the health of our oceans and coastal environments. I think clean water is essential to everything that inhabits our marine and freshwater ecosystems, and is also vital for humans and coastal communities as well. It influences the quality and the quantity of the food we can harvest from our oceans. And it sustains economic activities as well, in our case, tourism, coastal recreation, and fishing, among many others. However, we do know personally that pollution threatens the quality of our waters. And you know better than me that 80% of all pollutants that reach our oceans and coastal areas originated from land-based sources. And most notably, this includes toxicants, sediments, and excessive nutrients from untreated fresh wastewater, sewage, and septic systems, agricultural runoff, and deforestation, and oil and chemical spills, among many others. And we faced many of those during Hurricane Irma and Maria, so we do know firsthand how we can face all those threats and how to use the federal funding and the private nonprofits organizations to help build and face those challenges. The sources of those pollutions harm fish, marine habitat, and they also make river and ocean water unsafe for both human and wildlife. I think for example, and this is something that happens in Puerto Rico, and I assume in any other state, sewage discharges can pollute waterways with excess of nutrients. This fuels harmful algal blooms that risk human health and result in fish kills and coral reef die off. Land-based sources of pollution can also lead to the closures of beaches after rainstorms, negatively impacting not just our daily life, but tourism-based economies of coastal communities as well. Water quality degradation, therefore, presents a real and serious threat to our marine environment, our coastal communities, and human welfare. Addressing these problems requires that we employ a collaborative approach between the federal, local governments, industry, organizations, and other interested stakeholders like we're doing today. The federal governments play and can play a leading role in supporting these efforts, providing resources to restore and monitor water quality. And for example, through annual funding we provide in Congress, EPA Beach Act grant helps states and territories to develop and implement beach monitoring and notification programs to protect beachgoers from contaminated water. Similarly, through our Save Our Seas Act and the Save Our Seas Act 2.0, both of which I was proudly co-sponsored in Congress, we authorized NOAA's programs to address marine debris in our oceans and created new grants to prevent plastic waste from reaching our waterways. The bipartisan infrastructure law also provided $50 billion to EPA to improve our national drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure, which will be critical to ensure untreated sewage does not reach our surface waters. But perhaps one of the most effective ways the federal government can help restore water quality is by supporting watershed management initiatives. Watersheds Act can act as filters for runoff and provides clean water. And these management projects are thus an important tool to protect the marine and coastal habitats. The Coral program in NOAA as well, for instance, has developed watershed management and conservation plans to protect coral reef from land-based sources of pollution. And again, in the case of Puerto Rico, these have helped state and nonprofit partners to carry out our projects in priority watershed areas to mitigate sediment runoff from unpaved roads, which harm seagrasses, coral reef, and marine water quality as well. This is just a few examples of how watershed management efforts can help protect our marine resources. And I just want to say and conclude once again by thanking the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation for inviting me to join you today, and I'm looking forward to work together on behalf of our oceans and our coastal communities with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you once again, Congresswoman. We're really looking forward to working with her in her new role. So quickly, before we go into the lunch break, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what's next up on the agenda. We have a series of virtual breakouts being hosted by several of our wonderful partners, and this includes the Aquarium Conservation Partnership, NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, NOAA's Office of Ocean and Atmospheric Research, and the Hispanic Access Foundation. So if you're watching virtually, you can join online on the platform, or if you're here with us in person, you can watch on the CHOW Ocean mobile app, which is available either in the Google or Apple store. Or if you want to just take a break, there's the food court, and so there's some tasty things that you can have for lunch. Our next plenary will be back in this room at 1:15, where we'll be talking about food from the sea. So thank you very much, and thank you again to our wonderful panel.